Hi, and welcome back. We are moving into Ezekiel again, into chapter 4, but before we do that, I'd like you to dedicate this time to the Lord. Please ask the Holy Spirit for His divine wisdom, because that's ultimately where we're going to receive all of our revelations. So thanks again for joining me. This is a very crazy story so far, and it's going into detail of the rise of God against His own people and the judgment that He's going to put on them for their iniquity. So the first 3 chapters are the detail of calling Ezekiel into the prophetic, and also to identify his calling as a watchman and to be the watchman for Israel. And in order to do this, Ezekiel has to forego a normal life in order to serve God. This is a good reminder for us that sometimes God will be calling us into service for Him, and that also means for us that we're going to have to forego a normal life and maybe make some big sacrifices along the way in order to be faithful and obedient. So the first warning chapters are chapters 4 through to 24, and they are warnings to Israel pertaining to Jerusalem. Chapter 4 to 7 is the next warning prophecy, but Ezekiel remains silent during the entire prophecy. So, how does he provide a warning to his people with no voice? Well, the answer is simple. He uses role play. So he's told to inscribe Jerusalem on a brick, and he sets up a mini city model like an architect might, with his tools around him representing certain things. And he's told to lie on his left side and lay iniquity on it, and that's for a certain number of days. And then he's also told to lie on the other side and to lay iniquity on it for a certain number of days. And after that's come to pass, he lays the iniquity of the number of days according to the iniquity of each of the places mentioned. And he identifies this through his actions. So on the right side, he is to show the iniquity of the house of Judah, and he is communicating this without words, so he's acting out this entire scenario. But in order to make sense of it for us, we need to consider the culture and the history that it is making a point of. So going into verse 1, while the Jews were in Babylon, which is modern day Iraq, he's told to find a tablet and a brick and inscribe a city on it. That is an image, not the name of the city. He's told to inscribe an image. So that is a picture. And verse 2 gets the markers out to depict a siege of events that had already taken place, as well as a new one. At this point, 2 of the 3 sieges have taken place. The city is going to be destroyed, and the assumption is from the people of Israel that they're going to be going back into their land soon. However, this acting that he portrays to them reaffirms that no, they will not be going back into their city anytime soon, and to consider that would actually be a hopeless idea. Verse 4, he's told to lie on his left side, which we could consider would be a good part of each day, a significant amount of time, enough for people to observe it for 390 days. And he's to hold an iron plate between this little model of a city that he's created, and he's bearing his iniquity. He's carrying the symbol here of the house of Israel, and he's depicting himself as the house of the north and the south, showing them what will happen to Israel. He's told to keep the plate between himself and the city. This is to represent a steel or an iron plate separating them from the city, that there is a barrier or a wall or something of force that is keeping them, and his arm is bared, which is improper in the time to show any body part. So there's a part here that he's providing sort of an insult of sorts in revealing a part of himself or revealing a part of nature that is not to be revealed, especially not for a priest who was practicing to work in the temple. But this is the result of sins against God, and this is God's response, not his allowance of things to come. So this is God's actual response to the people of Israel for their continued rebellion. And there are long-term consequences for sin under the covenant. So Ezekiel is depicting here that for a total of 430 years, Israel won't be able to enjoy its city or its temple. And this takes us through to 156 BC. And the Maccabees were established and Israel got control and got their land back in 156 BC. And the recognition of this is the Hanukkah. And Israel has the promised land. God fulfills his promises to Israel in the millennial kingdom. They will receive it back. The old covenant was an example of what they would receive if they kept the old covenant. So verse 9 lists the food that Ezekiel is to put into a vessel and a mill and to make bread from. But only for the 390 days, not the additional 40 days. This grain represents Israel's poverty and preservation during the coming siege. This is about 8 to 9 slices of bread or 700 calories a day. So the quantity and the portions that Israel is going to be given by God are not significant portions. They are enough to stop them from dying and just enough to sustain life, but not to flourish or thrive in it. And a quart of water a day is certainly not enough to thrive again. It's enough to sustain life and nothing more. So this is just survival food, not flourishing food. And they make bread in an unclean and offensive way. And so he's told to make bread publicly using human feces as fuel for the fire. But Ezekiel complains to God about having to do this, as he's been a faithful servant and kept his ordinances and commandments and has been faithful and respectful of God's laws his entire life. And so he's not necessarily asking here or complaining so that he's questioning God's provision or his direction. He's just saying, this actually goes against my conscience. And so because he cries out to God with a conscience issue, God listens and hears him and lets him use cow dung as the option instead. Just consider for a moment that he's lying on his side for hours a day with these things on his body. People would be laughing at him, rebuking and mocking him constantly. And he's showing them a picture of what is to come. So he wasn't okay with the symbology of the human feces, but certainly in the prophecy, this is what was to come for the people of Israel. They were going to run out of fuel and they were going to be required to use their own feces as fuel to cook these bread cakes. So this is an illustration of the coming poverty for the people of Israel. And the famine that was created by the siege creates an anxiety of starvation. And as a result, the people of Israel end up becoming cannibals for about 18 months. The Babylonians starved them to the point of cannibalism. And God allowed this. This tells us that the cost of sin is bad. The cost of prophecy can also sometimes be humiliating, because he's spending the next 14 months of his life laying around, acting out a prophecy. So thanks very much for joining me on this chapter. We're going to continue to move into the next 3 chapters as we go through the prophecy here from 4 to 7. God's provision for his people and the land and the promises are going to be stripped away, and each of the coming chapters references each of these sections. So please join me in the next videos and we'll be discussing these in a little bit more detail. Thanks very much for watching. If you like this video, please like and share. It helps us get the message out. And also, if you have any questions, please pop them into the comments section and I'll be more than happy to answer. Thanks very much and God bless.